Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 43, and in today's episode we are covering the 11th book in the Young Jack Sparrow series, which is called Poseidon's Peak. This is the second to last book in the series, so we're getting really close to the end. And if you didn't listen to the last episode, we covered book 10, which was Sins of the Father. And I highly recommend you listen to that one, as it is my favorite book in this whole series, and it also includes the appearances of a few Pirates of the Caribbean movie characters. So please check that one out if you haven't already. But at the end of that book, Captain Teague drops Jack off on Isla Hermosa, and Jack is once again all alone with only a small boat to his name. And if you remember from the last book, the Barnacle finally met its end as it sank during the battle between the Royal Navy and Teague's ship, the Misty Lady. So Jack is even more alone, especially now that his entire crew is gone. Fitzwilliam P. Dalton III was actually a spy for the Royal Navy the entire time, and Jack left him behind on Admiral Lawrence Norrington's ship as he and Teague escaped. And as I said at the end of the last episode, we won't see Fitzy again in this book series. But we pick up here in Poseidon's Peak with Jack Sparrow setting off on his new adventure. So without further ado, let's dive into Book 11, Poseidon's Peak. All right, we're going to go right into the book here at the very beginning, and it says, "In the middle of the great blue Caribbean Sea, a lonely little boat made its way slowly across calm water. There was no name painted on its weather-worn hull. A pair of oars, old and full of splinters, assisted whoever might be crazy enough to use such a boat. The lone sailor aboard seemed to fit that description. The way he rambled to himself, anyone who overheard might think he had at least one other mate on board, possibly a whole crew. Tall peak, they said. Tall peak indeed. Bloody sea is flat as a johnny cake. Why can't anyone be more precise? Is sail 30 degrees south for 10 leagues and make a right so bloody hard?" The sailor's name was Jack Sparrow. Once he'd had a crew and a boat that he believed to be a ship, but now he found himself all but lost at sea. Alone. The skiff glided past a string of small, beautiful islands. They were covered in dense green jungle and populated by exotic, brightly colored birds. But they completely lacked anything like a mountain or a peak or even a hill, and they grew smaller and smaller as Jack sailed on. At the very end of the archipelago was one particularly tiny island, about the size of a boulder. A single albatross perched on it. The one bird was about all the rock had room for. Jack rolled his eyes. Not 2 days ago, he had been given a tip by a beautiful woman on a beautiful island. She told him that great treasure was to be found somewhere in this vicinity, on an island with a very tall peak. So far, no such peak was forthcoming. After another hour of pleasantly quiet sailing, a larger silhouette finally began to appear on the horizon. Jack sat up and kept a firmer grasp on the oars. A big island came into view. A real island, with valleys, hills, dales, mountains, peaks. Mayhap I'll dock there, Jack said casually, tacking into the wind. He didn't want to act too excited. Fate had a way of figuring out when he was happy about something, and then ruining it. The adventures he'd been through over the previous year had proven that. "But the Barnacle got me through it all," he said, a little sadly. The Barnacle was Jack's old boat. It had recently been blown to bits by the Royal Navy. Tatty little rust bucket though she was, she got the job done. She was a fine vessel. With the, he gestured with his hands, modeling his old ship in the air. 2 sails, and he mimed opening a door. Hold, downstairs, and he mimed rowing. Then he realized that while he was reminiscing about his old boat, the one he was currently sailing had started to drift the wrong way. He quickly acted to redirect himself. "And the crew," he finished, irritated. "Here I have to get all the work done myself, and I don't think that's quite fair, do you?" he asked, before remembering he was all alone. His eyes popped open and his nose wrinkled in a scowl. "Not that I miss them, that crew of mine," he added, seemingly unaffected by the fact that he was talking to himself, although Arabella wasn't a bad sort. Arabella Smith had been Jack's first mate. She had believed her mother was dead, then later discovered she was alive and well, and living a pirate's life. Arabella decided to sail with her mother aboard her ship, the Fleur de la Morte. Jack missed her sometimes. but he never admitted it. Still reflecting on his crew, Jack looked moodily out over the sea. Then he brightened. "Well, to Davy Jones' locker with them. The lot of them. Look at me. Here I am, captain of my own boat, my own destiny." He slapped aside and yelped as a particularly large splinter stabbed his hand. As the boat gently drifted onto the sandy shore, Jack leaped out energetically. "Ah, look at this view." He took a deep breath, gesturing to the beautiful island. "Just look at it. Blue sky, sunny sun, sparkling sea. It's a bright Caribbean day. It's a brand new day for Captain Jack Sparrow. I am a free and independent man. Ahem. Free and independent captain." He posed dramatically, one foot up on a rock, the cliffs and peaks behind him, the sea before him. No boat full of idiots to look after, no dad chasing after me. This is the beginning of a whole new life. He laid down, supporting himself on his elbows. A playful, sweet-scented breeze blew. The warm sand comfortably supported his back. The sun beamed down warmly. "This is the life," he said, smiling. This was, in fact, more relaxed than he had been at any point in the past year. There was no one as far as the eye could see. Peaceful and deserted. A quick snooze on the beach and then a hunt for treasure. Life just didn't get any better than this. Of course, life rarely stayed good for very long. "Jack Sparrow," a voice called out scratchily. Jack squinched his eyes. No, it couldn't be. No, not here. He warily turned around to look up at the beach, wondering what fate had decided to throw at him this time, how it planned to ruin his perfect moment. Staggering down the beach toward him was a young man, older than Jack, but not much, bleeding from head to toe. There wasn't a limb or appendage that wasn't gashed or scraped. His clothes were shredded and matted with dirt and dried blood. Dark breeches, a white shirt, an old waistcoat, a sword. Jack reached for his own sword instinctually. The man looked like someone who hadn't quite decided to become a pirate. He was dressed like a pirate, but something in his eyes. Someone fleeing his destiny. "Jack Sparrow," the man groaned again. Then he collapsed onto the sand. Okay, so we're off to a crazy start here. We have this mystery man who somehow knows Jack's name. And that's not all. This guy is bleeding all over his body and passes out on the beach. So Jack goes over to him and he thinks this guy is dead. Especially when some flies and birds become attracted to the body, Jack slowly backs up and makes his way back to his boat. But then he realizes that his boat has been pulled out to sea by the tide. So now Jack gets really annoyed since he is stuck on this island alone with no boat and a dead body. So he walks back over to the corpse and he realizes the guy is not as dead as Jack thought. So in the book it says, "Then a cold, dead set of fingers wrapped themselves around his ankle." Yeah! Jack leaped straight up into the air, whirling around. Lying back on the sand, but still gripping Jack's ankle, was the man Jack had thought was dead. "Not quite dead yet, then, eh?" Jack said bravely, recovering his breath. The other man just panted and heaved. Jack sighed, a bit relieved. He'd come back to the man because he knew he couldn't make it off the island alone. A raft wasn't going to just build itself. Treasure wasn't going to dig itself up out of the ground. This bloody guy might be some use, if he healed. The man tried to speak, but only a dry whisper and a hacking cough came out. He imploringly reached out his other hand to Jack. Jack sighed and knelt down. He put his arm under the other man's shoulders and carefully raised him up. Sand stuck wherever there was blood, and his hair was dreaded with scabs and dead flesh. A real mess. Jack tried to hold him away a little to keep from getting his own clothes mucked up. "Jack Sparrow," the bloody man managed to groan again. Jack rolled his eyes. Yes, you know my name. What do you want, a blue ribbon? Half the bloody Caribbean knows who I am. But the question remains, who are you? I don't recall," the man said, coughing. Jack turned the man's face into the sunlight. He tried to see past the wounds and swelling, but it was difficult. This was a weird situation, even for Jack, who had seen so much. All alone on a deserted island, and the only other person who was half dead and somehow knew who Jack was. Maybe if Jack got the man cleaned up a bit, he'd be able to recognize him. "All right, here's what we'll do, mate," Jack said brightly. He stood, lifting the man with him, and staggered to the edge of the sea. When they reached the shore, Jack tossed the man in. "All you need is a good bath. Get you all cleaned up. Make you feel all ship-shape and new. Don't forget your pits, mind." The man howled in pain, seemingly mustering every last bit of energy he had in order to holler. "Oh, right," Jack said, remembering the Caribbean was a sea, full of salt water. He put a finger to his lips. "How's that old expression go? Like rubbing salt on wounds, or some such? Sorry about that, mate." The man sat in the shallow water, dripping, stinging, and miserable, but the shock seemed to have revived him some. He shook his head and wiped the blood out of his eyes. He ran his fingers through his hair. He even patted down his clothes, but they were stained beyond hope. Underneath the blood and grime, he turned out to be a fairly handsome man, maybe 10 years older than Jack, but maybe less than that. Slightly built with light brown hair, clean shaven, soulful blue-gray eyes, the color of the sea. Nice cheekbones. Jack didn't recognize him in the slightest. Bill collector, maybe? Jack asked, trying to guess who might know his name and be looking for him, though he'd never seen him before. Jack brushed his hand over his sword. Angry father of virtuous daughter? Cousin? Or perhaps just some random bloke I found in the sand and then gave a good, sharp dunking to? But the man didn't seem angry at all. He just shrugged. In fact, he seemed surprisingly calm and even-tempered considering how Jack had almost drowned him. He should have been chasing Jack deep into the jungle if he were a normal man. Clearly, he was not a normal man, but meeting crazy folks was nothing new to Jack. "Can you not at least remember who beat you up like as such?" he demanded, waving his hand indicating the now clean but still oozing wounds on the man's body. The other man shook his head slightly. "Weren't a man," he said slowly. "Coral and rocks under water. Barnacles and razor-sharp shells." Jack nodded. It fit the lacerations on his skin. "Thrown overboard then, were you?" The man shook his head helplessly. "I cannot remember correctly. The last thing was a dark cavern. No, glittering." His voice grew excited as he remembered. "From torchlight. It was gold, glittering gold and gems, rooms of them, in the caverns." Jack's eyes widened. "It was deep inside a mountain, or cliffs. What was it called?" The man ran a hand through his hair, trying to remember. Improbably, Jack's eyes widened further. "Something about a peak, maybe?" Jack suggested casually. "Yes! Poseidon's Peak!" the man cried out, slapping his hands together. "That's it! That's the last place I remember before whatever happened." Jack jumped up and down enthusiastically. "Well, where is it then, mate?" Jack asked. I did not know," the man said, holding his hand to his brow, closing his eyes and shaking his head. Jack frowned, squinting at the man. This treasure upon Poseidon's Peak was sounding suspiciously like the treasure he was looking for. So a near-dead man comes out of nowhere on a deserted island who just happens to know Jack's name and the name of the place where Jack's treasure probably was? That was way too many coincidences for one sunny Caribbean afternoon. Jack sized the other man up. The man was breathing heavily, still obviously weak. Not much of a threat, even with his sword. "Look, I'll lay it to you straight, mate," Jack said, putting his hand on the man's shoulder. "I don't know you from Adam, and I find it mighty suspicious seeming that you know me, and you know this place, and I just happen to be here in this place, and there's no one else for leagues around. So I'm just a little bit concerned about the fact that you know who I am, and I don't know who you are. Savvy?" "I'm sorry," the man said sheepishly. "I wish I could tell you more. All I know is that I needed to find you. It was important that I reach you. I need your help. Or someone needs your help." "You obviously need some sort of help, mate," Jack muttered, watching another fly land on the man's wounds to suck up some blood. He really wished that he wasn't the only person around to give help. Not that he wished the man any ill luck, but Jack wasn't the sort of person who just randomly helped someone if he wasn't going to get something out of it. Although, when Jack thought about it, maybe the man could help him. If he indeed came from Poseidon's Peak, and that's where this important treasure was, Jack would have had the fortune that sunk with the Barnacle replenished in no time. And the faster Jack got to the treasure he so richly deserved, the faster Jack would be able to buy a whole new boat and live off the rest of his loot forever. Then he would really be free from everyone and everything. "All right, mate, I've decided to offer my very noble help to you in your, very sorry predicament," he said glibly, putting out his hand. "But first, we've got to figure out exactly who you are and who else it is has the honorable pleasure of needing my help." All right. So what Jack is able to find out about this man is that he knows about Poseidon's Peak, which is what Jack is trying to find. And apparently, this guy has seen the treasure in a cavern, and he went to find Jack for help. But this guy doesn't remember much else about himself, and he doesn't even remember his name. So Jack then tries for hours to get this guy to remember who he is, or anything else important that he might know. The two of them then realize it is getting dark, so they end up building a fire and try to get some rest. And the mystery man then falls asleep, and Jack quickly tries to inspect his clothes to see if he can find anything identifying the guy, but he finds nothing but a few coins and some coral. So Jack relinquishes his search and tries to get some sleep for himself. But when he opens his eyes, he finds himself in a longboat out on the sea with no oars. So we're going to go back into the book and see what Jack dreams about. So in the book, it says, dreaming about what a perfect world it would be if it weren't for other people, Jack's eyes began to close. Suddenly, he was drifting out to sea, in a longboat, with no oars. Jack frowned his typical, "What's going on here?" frown. He grasped the side of the boat to make sure it was real. He got a splinter. It was still night, but unlike the night of a few minutes ago, there was a giant full moon hanging low over the ocean. Only a few stars were able to shine through its brightness. The sea was very still, the boat barely rocking on the water. Silence blanketed the sea. Jack said, raising an eyebrow. He dipped a finger in the water and tasted it. Salty. Just like the ocean should be, he said, unsure what that proved. He sat back and thought. The truth was, he didn't know whether or not he was dreaming. It seemed like a dream, but it felt so real. Then the ocean exploded. In a foamy, seaweedy maelstrom, a huge leviathan called the Kraken rose up out of the depths with a mighty roar. It was the feared ghost ship Captain Davy Jones's pet, and its powerful tentacles were waving against the moonlit sky. Jack stood on the boat, balancing, and reached for his sword. But the tentacles quickly wrapped themselves around him, pinning him down to the deck. One tentacle slid around his throat and began to tighten. With a crack, the Kraken pulled and broke the longboat in half. The fore and aft ends rose high out of the water. Boards and pieces of deck flew jaggedly through the air. The monster pulled Jack down through flotsam and jetsam, dragging him under the ocean. Jack struggled, one hand tearing at the tentacle around his neck. With the other hand, he desperately tried to reach anything sharp, his knife, anything. But he was still being dragged further into the deep. Water began to choke him. Bubbles floated up out of his mouth toward the surface. He struggled harder, tearing at the tentacles' leaves. Leaves? Suddenly Jack realized it wasn't tentacles that were holding him tight, but long, thin vines? He was no longer underwater. He was now falling from the sky. The sun was out. It was a beautiful day. Below, green countryside spread out before him like paradise. No jungle, just trees and meadows and hedges and the occasional cow. Vaporous clouds were falling with him, down, down, down toward the ground, which was rapidly rushing up, up to meet Jack, in a hard, unsurvivable landing sort of way. Jack hurtled toward the earth, and then he began to slow down. The vines around his legs jerked back, preventing him from crashing. His nose came perilously close to crushing a small green worm. Jack and the worm had less than a second to look at each other in surprise and dismay. Because right before he hit the ground, the vines sprung back up, taking Jack with them. Up he flew, almost weightlessly. He jogged in the air and waved his hands around a bit, trying to get hold of something, but the vines were now slack. It didn't matter, though, because something else in the sky distracted him from his flying fate. Mermaids. Mermaids were swimming through the sky, beautiful with aquamarine and silvery scales. Long red, blonde, and ebony hair flowed through the breeze. They sang and leaped and laughed, much nicer than the scaly tails he was used to dealing with. "That's it. I've gone completely bonkers," Jack said, refusing to believe any of this was real. He shook his head, trying to knock some sense into himself. Then he landed on the ground with a loud whoomp. There was no sign of the little green worm. "Well, could have been worse," he said, trying to sound reasonable. But it was quite difficult to sound reasonable after being attacked by the Kraken and then flying through the sky with mermaids. He brushed himself off and patted his clothes. Where in the 7 seas did I fall from, he wondered, and put his hand to his brow to look up at the sky. Oh, he gulped. The sky was the sea. Literally. It was as though the whole ocean had turned upside down and hung above the earth. It was bright blue, like on a perfect day. White caps and foam danced on its surface like clouds. It might have fooled the eye into believing it was the sky with scattered cloud cover, if it weren't for the occasional whale and dolphin leaping out of the water. "All right, then," Jack said slowly, forcing himself to look down at the ground again. He was standing on top of a black mountain. Whistling eerily, a harsh wind blew mist through sharp stones and crags. "Poseidon's Peak, perhaps?" Jack asked optimistically. He carefully picked his way through the stones and over the boulders, looking for some sign of a path. Here and there, solitary, stunted pines grew in gnarls against the wind. An icy stream of water trickled down lichen-covered rocks. Jack stuck his finger into the stream and tasted it. Salty, he said, a little surprised. He licked the rest of his finger anyway. Part of him, a little, tiny part of him, barely a shadow, wished someone else were there to help him. Arabella, for instance. She would have had some long-winded explanation for everything that just happened, and why a mountain spring would taste like saline. Then he found something that cheered him up immensely. A cave, carved into the side of a mountain, into a wall of solid rock, carved by hand, not by wind and rain. Someone had ventured up this very dangerous peak before him, and spent a lot of time hacking out a chamber. Someone who must have had something very important, very valuable, to stash away. Jack rubbed his hands together gleefully. He hopped into the cave and whistled to himself. It was pitch black, but even so, when he turned a corner, he saw things glittering in the dark. Gold, shiny glittery things, piles and piles of coins, chests of jewels, baskets of crowns and scepters. With a grin, Jack reached down and picked up one perfect gold doubloon. The rest of the treasure vanished. "Oh, come on," Jack said, closing his eyes in frustration. When he opened his eyes, the entire cavern was filled with skeletons. Hundreds of them. "Must stop doing that," closing my eyes. "Terrible things happen when the lights are out, as it were," Jack said uneasily. He gripped the doubloon tightly and took a step backward. He turned to run. A skeleton fell from the ceiling onto his shoulders. Jack yelped. The sound of 100,000 chattering teeth filled the cavern. Bony arms reached up from the floor and out from the walls. A cold, bony hand gripped his arm. "Billy," it groaned. "Ah!" Jack screamed. And then he saw the sun had risen. He had been dreaming. He was back on the beach. The sand was cold and damp beneath him. Tiny wavelets lapped at the shore. Everything was perfectly normal. Except for the still wounded man grabbing his arm and shouting like a mad drunk from the Faithful Bride Inn. "Billy!" he shouted again. "My name is Billy!" So Jack wakes up from his dream-nightmare hybrid, and we find out the mystery man has remembered his name. He says that his name is Billy, which lets us guess as to whom this may be. I won't say anything yet, but I'll let you ponder that for a little bit. But anyway, Jack has this weird dream that kind of turns into a nightmare very fast. First, he sees a tentacle of the Kraken that drags him down beneath the waves. Then he's falling from the sky, and then he sees the ocean above him in the sky, along with mermaids swimming up above him. What I interpreted from this is that it's alluding to Davy Jones' locker, especially with the mermaids up above. We know from Jack's earlier encounters with the mermaids in this series that they reside in a place that is not of the normal world. Their cavern that Jack found himself in during the Siren Song and the Sword of Cortez is a place that resides in Davy Jones' locker. And of course, from At World's End, we have the whole up is down scene and the water being the gateway between the worlds. So that's what I think the ocean in the sky business is supposed to mean. But anyway, we pick up with Jack and Billy, and Jack tries to think of a good pirate name for him. He tells Billy that he needs a good name, like Renegade Robbie does. So he decides to name Billy Bloody Billy, given that he is covered in blood. Very fitting name. But Jack tells him they should head for the tall peak on the island, given that it's the only peak around, so it must be Poseidon's Peak. And this mountain also happens to be the same mountain from Jack's dream, so the two of them begin to make their way through the jungle toward it. So let's go back into the book and see what happens next. 2 hours later, they were still trudging uphill through the jungle. Jack was experiencing a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he had done this all before. Of course, it was all because he had done this before. In practically every blasted adventure he'd experienced, there had been jungle, sun, and insects, and more jungle and more trudging through said jungle. If he didn't find treasure this time, he was headed someplace cool and flat. Quebec City, maybe, or the Outer Hebrides. "Look, why don't you just step backward mentally like," Jack suggested to Bloody Billy. "Try to walk back through what happened to you. How are you wound up on this island, for instance?" "I really can't seem to, Jack," Billy said, panting harder and putting a hand to his side. Jack wasn't sure if this was because he was still injured or if he were out of breath from the hike. Jack sighed. "It would just make everything ever so much easier. When we get to Poseidon's Peak, I mean. We'd know how to get into any secret passageway we might encounter, what to experience once we're in there, where precisely this great and very valuable treasure is. How many skeletons we have to fight off." "Skeletons?" Billy asked. "Oh, nothing. Forget that last part," Jack said. "You still can't remember anything? Not even about your mom and dad?" Not a thing, Jack, Billy said sorrowfully. Well, let me tell you a little bit about me, then, Jack said cheerfully. He loved talking about himself. It's quite fascinating, and maybe it will jog your own memory. About a year ago, I had up to my nostrils with the old family back home. Sick of them and the whole family business. Didn't know what I wanted for myself, you know. Needed to do a little examination of the old soul. I commandeered a boat away from the Royal Navy. Great ship, called the Barnacle. Did it all by myself, too. Then I figured it would be nice to have a crew around. You know, to order about and whatnot. They did a right fine job of keeping a ship as majestic and grand as the Barnacle in order. Crew, Billy said strangely. Yes, crew, Jack said, annoyed at being interrupted. There was this wonderful first mate, lovely girl, with surprisingly strong ankles, could haul a rope like no one's business. And Fitzy, well, dear old Fitzy turned out to not be such a loyal member of my crew. Crew, Billy said, thinking. Yes, crew, Jack said, exasperated again. A ship, Billy said slowly. Yes, a crew does usually operate aboard a ship. And hold your heart, lad. Don't want any cardiac stoppage here. 1 + 1 equals 2, Jack said. A boat, Billy added. Yes, a boat can have a crew, too. And a captain, Jack said. Then, growing unreasonably enraged, she shouted, And I defy anyone present or otherwise to say that I can't. Perhaps Jack wasn't so convinced that the Barnacle had been a ship after all. The crew, Billy tried again, thinking hard. They were looking for the treasure. Jack's eyes popped open. Someone else was looking for his treasure? Whose crew? What crew? Jack demanded. Are they pirates? Oh, yes, Billy said, staring into the distance. They are pirates, I'm certain of it. Well, then let's double time it, mate, Jack said, marching faster. We'd best get to the peak before this nasty crew of pirates gets there and gets all the treasure. He cast a worried eye up at the mountain. They were only halfway there. And while there was no sign of a treacherous, treasure-hungry pirate crew climbing their way to the top, Jack had a feeling that it was only a matter of time. Another hour of hard hiking brought them above the tree line. It was slow going because the only paths were along game trails, and the game on this island seemed to be quite small. Rabbits or tiny pigs or something that only made 4-inch walkways. They stopped to survey the peak. Jack took a deep breath and sighed contentedly. Billy looked like he was going to throw up. He was bent over, breathing raggedly. Streams of sweat were running down his face. His puffy eye was even more swollen now. Well, look at that, Jack said, pushing aside a strangely familiar, stunted bush. Nestled at the base of 2 crags was a small temple. What it lacked in size, it made up for in decoration, ornately carved with icons of winged gods and butterflies and skulls. Well, that wasn't so difficult, Jack said with a grin. And not a pirate to be seen. Luck is finally with Jack Sparrow. Let me just go in first, have a look around. But before Jack could finish his thought, he was knocked over the head with something hard, and everything went black. Okay, so Jack and Billy then wake up a little later, and they see that they are tied up. And Jack sees that they have been captured by the island's natives. And Jack obviously has no idea what they are saying, but Billy is somehow able to translate some of their language. So we're going to go back into the book and see what happens next. Ah, I believe he's saying he's the leader of this village, Billy said. Jack looked at him in surprise, and Billy looked just as surprised that he could understand this strange language. We've trespassed on their mountain and their sacred site without, asking permission, he continued. We need permission to climb a blasted mountain and look for treasure? What is this world coming to? Jack declared. The leader, seeing Billy translate, continued speaking. He spoke slowly now and louder, as if that would help the stupid foreigners understand. He challenges one of us to a duel for our freedom. Jack perked up. Challenge was good. Duel was good too. And freedom was even better. If we win, we are free to go. If we lose, we must remain slaves until such time as our masters die. Well then, who are our masters? Jack asked brightly. Probably a pair of old folk who need help around the house or in some fields, opening jars, things like that. They'll be dead sooner than you can say die. Nothing to worry about, Bloody, my friend. The village chief stood aside. A pair of children, a boy and a girl, 6 years old at most, stepped forward. They had long black hair and serious eyes. Their arms were crossed. Ah, I believe these 2 are the masters in question, Jack, Billy said regretfully. Jack's eyes bugged out of his head. They're our masters? Until they die? He yelped. The girl said something sternly, pointing at Jack. "She says you look untrustworthy," Billy translated, "but you have nice hair, like a girl's." "You know," Jack says snippetly, "it is incredibly convenient you can't remember a blasted thing about your past, or the fact that dangerous natives are guarding the treasure you were so excited about, but you have no issue at all speaking some obscure language maybe only 500 people in the world know about." Billy shrugged. "I can't tell you why some things have been lost to my memory and not others." "Excuses," Jack said grumpily. The leader of the islanders grew impatient and demanded something. Billy responded and held out his hands. One of the other warriors came forward and cut through the vines that bound them. Then they handed Billy a spear. "Now wait just a blasted moment," Jack said, not liking what he was seeing. "What in the name of all that's holy, not to mention all the things that aren't, is going on here?" "I have offered myself to be the one who engages in battle," Billy said flatly. "Since I am the one who got us into this conundrum, I'll get us out of it." "The bloody bones you will," Jack snorted. "Look at you, you're a mess. You can hardly see out of your left eye, and your sword arm is so chopped up it looks like the waste room of a tackle shop." "How did you know this was my sword arm?" Billy asked in wonder, gripping his right hand. "I didn't. They're both chopped up like a plate of bait," Jack said impatiently. "I'm not going to risk eternal servitude to a 6-year-old brat." The girl frowned at him condescendingly, as if she could understand, but Jack kept on going. "Because some man who has nearly drowned, been pulled over a razor-sharp coral, and sucked at by remorse is getting all noble on me." "I'm sorry, Jack, but it is my duty," Billy responded stubbornly. "It's my fault, and I'm the older man, more experienced in these sorts of things." "Well, I do admire the ethics of your self-sacrifice," Jack said sarcastically. "In my view, anyone who volunteers himself for potential damage is a blazing lunatic. But I've often found in times like this, it's better to be pragmatic than noble. And pragmatism would tend to dictate that a younger man fight the good fight, if you know what I mean. Younger, faster, quicker, fewer bloody wounds, can remember my own last name, senility not set in yet, no troubles recalling how I got to this island or about who my crew is or who or where any pirates looking for treasure in the vicinity might be, savvy?" Billy sighed, looking at the spear in his hand sadly. "If you're really insisting," Billy said softly. "It's for my own neck, mind you, not out of the goodness of my own heart," Jack pointed out. "Now tell them to untie me." Billy hung his head and said something to the leader. The leader shrugged, then gestured to his warriors. They took the spear from Billy and tied him up again. Then they untied Jack and handed him the same spear. But Jack's hands immediately flew to his hips. Unsurprisingly, they had taken his sword. Unfortunately, they also seemed to have taken the 2 or 3 knives that he had hidden elsewhere on his body. The leader said something to Billy. "They have taken away our weapons, but they will be returned at the end of the challenge. If we win," Billy explained. Jack frowned. Not only did he love his sword, but right now, more than ever, he needed it. "If we lose," Billy went on, "we will be tortured with them." Jack's eyes bulged. He tried not to imagine what sort of creative things an entire tribe and one very mean-looking 6-year-old girl could do with 3 knives and a sword. "Well, I guess this will do," he said bravely, shaking the spear. The warriors backed off into a circle, surrounding the leader and Jack. The leader took off his collar of beads and a few of his feathers, handing them to the young boy who had become Jack's master. Someone handed the leader a spear. The leader's spear looked as primitive as Jack's, just a piece of sharpened wood. Then one of the warriors let out a fierce cry and the battle began. The leader of the tribe held the spear over his shoulder with one hand, using the other to steady it. He planted his feet and eyed Jack. Jack held the spear as it were a sword, which was the only weapon he ever really learned how to use. He gripped it in his right hand, slashing it back and forth in the air like a foil. Billy closed his eyes and groaned, but not in pain this time, more like hopelessness. "Take that," Jack said, dancing ridiculously from foot to foot. The other man spun and thrust his spear. Jack barely leaped out of the way in time. When the leader pulled his spear back, there was a piece of Jack's clothing stuck to the tip. "Hey," Jack said, but before he could come up with a witty insult, the leader lunged again. Jack tried to parry it the way he would parry a sword blow, but his light wooden spear was easily knocked away. The warrior's spear point was scraped against Jack's thigh, drawing blood. "Ouch!" Jack hissed, rolling into the dust. He clenched his teeth in pain. The other man said something and laughed. The rest of his warriors laughed too. "Don't bother translating," Jack told Billy. "I get the idea." The leader had just been playing around with him. Now he set his eyes and gripped his spear tighter. This was it. This was serious now. With a blood-curdling cry, the other man ran at Jack. Jack had also cried out and turned to run toward his opponent. The leader planted his sword in the dust and used it to vault into Jack, knocking him down with his feet. Jack hit the ground hard, teeth jarring inside his head. The leader pulled his spear up one smooth motion and held it to Jack's neck, planting a foot on his chest. It looked like it was over. Jack and Billy were going to be slaves to a pair of malicious 6-year-olds for the rest of their lives. Jack took a deep breath and rolled, right in between the other man's legs. Before he could react, Jack leaped up and stabbed him smack on the rear end. The leader fell over, eyes popping in pain. The circle of warriors looked on, shocked. "All right, not a regulation move, but," Jack said, running over to Billy. He wasn't sure if he had won or not, but he was sure wasn't going to waste the opportunity to escape. He untied Billy. "We should go," Billy said, turning to run. "Ah, not without the treasure, mate," Jack said, turning back to the temple. "We really need to get out of here," Billy insisted. The tribal chief was still howling in pain. The warriors were standing over him, looking at Jack and trying to figure out what to do next. Jack simply took off toward the temple. "Wait, Jack, don't go in there," Billy begged, running after him. "This place—" His running galvanized the tribe. As one, the warriors shook their spears and ran after him. Jack bounced, leaping over the rocks and zigzagging wildly, trying to lose them. Billy followed as best he could, considering how wounded he was. The tribe followed him, doing a much better job. Still, judging from the tracks in the jungle, they were experienced in hunting nothing more dangerous than bunnies, which somehow made this all a lot less scary to Jack. After tracing a roundabout way, Jack finally made it to the temple door and threw himself inside. It was dark and quiet, and free from crazed warriors and their spears. It was also free of any gold. "What on the 7 seas?" Jack demanded, looking around. The only thing in the main room, which was also the only room, was a simple stone throne. It was surrounded by offerings of the sweetest-smelling flowers, and fish. And on the throne was a cat. A disgusting, huge, mangy old thing with overgrown claws. Garlands of berries and flowers were draped around her neck. "Constance?" Jack cried. There was no mistaking Constance. She was the cat that Jack had sailed with when a Creole sailor named John was part of his crew. John always insisted that Constance was really his sister, mystically transformed into a cat by the soothsayer Teodalma. Jack had not seen her since John's best friend Tumen, and the cat had all set off for the Yucatan aboard Arabella's mother's ship, the Fleur de la Mort. The cat on the throne mewed happily, then began to purr. It was a purr that sounded satisfied in its grumpiness. Yep, it was Constance, all right. So that's right, Constance is back. As to why she is here on this island, well, that we will come to find out soon. But anyway, Constance is very happy to see Jack again, and she leaps into his arms. But of course, this annoys Jack. He drops her onto the ground right before the natives run in, and we find out they have been worshipping her. But Jack doesn't care who or what they are worshipping. He cares about where the treasure is. If you remember from Jack's dream earlier when he came into this cave, there was treasure filling up the room, but now there is nothing. So Jack asks Billy where the treasure is, but Billy tells him this place is not familiar to him at all. Jack, of course, gets angry at this, but when Billy asks the natives something in their language, Jack hears him say the word Poseidon, but the natives shake their heads no. Jack then gets even more annoyed, knowing they have come to the wrong place. Even though he knows Constance won't be able to reply to him, he asks her where John and Tumen are, and why she is here and not them. Since they're not at all close to the Yucatan, he has no idea how Constance could have ended up here. But Billy says the cat seems familiar to him, and he asks the natives how Constance got here. They tell him that she swam here, and they believed her to be a manifestation of a sea goddess, given that cats can't swim. But the mention of the sea makes Billy go into a daze again, and he starts to remember something about Poseidon's Peak. With a little help from Jack, and specifically this help is just yelling at Billy, he is able to remember something. To get to Poseidon's Peak, they need to travel over the sea. So Jack and Billy, along with Constance, make their way to the beach. And of course, the natives instantly clear a path for them with Constance, since they still worship her. So anyway, the three of them make their way back to the shore, and immediately Jack makes them begin searching for any clues pertaining to the water. More specifically, Jack is looking for footprints on the beach. They walk around the entire island before not finding anything and giving up. So Jack makes a new plan and decides to make a new boat. So he tasks Billy and Constance with finding materials for a makeshift boat, and Jack ends up falling asleep as he is looking for wood logs. So we're going to go back into the book, and we find out, of course, Jack fell asleep, and it says, apparently, assembling a ship was exactly what Jack was in the middle of doing when he fell asleep. He woke the next morning uncomfortably draped over a log. Billy and Constance were peering at him a little too closely for first thing in the morning, or in Constance's case, a little too closely for any time at all. Was that? Good tree here, Jack said, pretending that he was just testing it for strength. He struck the side of it with a weary hand, hollow and all. It looked like you were asleep there, Jack, Billy said innocently. We were worried about you. When we woke up, you were gone. Constance gave Jack a far less innocent look, like she suspected he was up to no good. What are you all standing around for then, Jack said, slurring his words with exhaustion and stifling a yawn. Go find some logs, too, or we're never getting off this island. Savvy? For the next few hours, the three worked as hard as they could to build a raft. Constance mostly supervised. She meowed when she thought something wasn't being done just right, and tested pieces of wood by sharpening her long yellow claws on them. Of course, it was difficult to work at all without the right tools. Any tools, really. They could only look for fallen trees, since they didn't have any machetes or axes to cut down live ones. And once they found a usable log, there was no way to cut it down to the same size as the others. Jack's brilliant idea of using vines to tie them all together failed, because the only vines they could find were short ones, like those the islanders bound their hands with. They couldn't get them around the girth of the logs. After spending an hour trying to burrow through the end of a log with a tiny knife he used for eating, Jack finally gave up. Hopeless, he declared, as if he thought it had been a stupid idea all along. He even wondered why his colleagues would even have encouraged him to do it. Billy just sighed and stopped pounding his own log, which he had been beating with an awkward stone. Constance meowed, a strange tone in her kitty voice. What's that? What'd you find? Jack asked with interest. Then he mentally kicked himself for talking to a cat he hated, no less. She was a little way into the jungle, sniffling and raising a single paw at something sticking out of the ground. I think she wants us to go look over there, Billy translated. Really? Jack said sarcastically. He threw up his hands to the heavens. Why, oh why, must I be cursed to spend eternity on an island with a creepy-eyed sailor who might be a pirate, and the foulest beast ever to sail the seas? What have I done? And the time I took that chest of gold from Grandmama does not count. After all, it wasn't hers to begin with. After his rant, Jack stomped over to Constance to take a look. Billy meekly followed. Carbuncles and corsets, Jack said when he saw what she was looking at. It was part of a wheel sticking up out of the ground. A solid white wheel with a rim and few spokes poking out. He began clawing at the dirt like a cat. Why are you doing that? Billy asked. How will a wheel help us, even one as sturdy as this? Because, if this is a part of a carriage or wagon, it had to get here somehow, Jack explained. Maybe a ship wrecked here. Maybe a ship with rowboats. Maybe a ship that works that can get us off this bloody island. Failing that, a wagon carriage will be more easily rigged into a raft than some old dead trees. He imagined with horror what it would look like. Captain Jack Sparrow standing at the helm of a carriage, floating on the water, wheels still attached. Sail made out of a bandana. Billy sitting in the prow, staring out to sea with his dreamy eyes and slack jaw. Constance sitting in the corner, stinking a little. From the Barnacle to a little dinghy to this. How, oh how had Jack fallen so far? And still no treasure, or any direction in life, really. It just wasn't fair. But at least it wasn't a usual wagon. As he and Billy, with occasional help from Constance, furiously unearthed the thing, it became clear it was a chariot, like something out of the days of the Roman Empire. It was little more than a pair of wheels and a platform with 3 walls, open at the back. But what a beautiful chariot! It was light and delicate, made of something creamy white that was neither wood nor metal. Covering the sides were carvings of all sorts of sea things, starfish, barracuda, and monsters, like the kraken. Details were set off with brilliant aquamarine gems and pearls. Jack ran his hand over it admiringly. Then he licked it. Jack nodded. Coral. As I suspected, it's made of coral, he said in wonder. So after finding this coral carriage, they then realize there's something moving in the sand nearby. And they see that it's actually 2 real horses underneath the sand, which is kind of insane. And they're kind of blue horses, very strange looking. They make their way out of the sand and they pull the chariot into the water. They stand there in the shallows waiting for Jack. So Jack and Billy and Constance get on the carriage, and the horses then take off across the water. And they make their way all the way across the water, and then they begin to dip into the water. So the horses in the chariot go down beneath the water, and to save themselves, Jack, Billy, and Constance jump out of the carriage and swim over to the little spit of land that Jack saw a seagull on earlier, the super tiny spit of land. And once they get here, Billy says, "Oh," his face lighting up, "I know where we are now." Jack sighed, closing his eyes. He was very near losing his temper, and he did not want to be accused at some later date of drowning a mentally ill individual. But still, he was really, really tired of Bloody Billy. "Oh yes," Jack said sarcastically, "and where might that be?" "We're up on top of Poseidon's Peak." Alright, so we have now officially arrived at Poseidon's Peak if we believe what Billy is saying. And obviously Jack and the group have reached somewhere important as the ocean chariot they were riding dove down under the water. So the three of them are now crowded on this little tiny spot of land, and Jack does what he does best, and that is argue. Okay, so back in the book, Jack says, "Are you out of your blasted mind?" Jack said calmly. "Oh, excuse me, I forgot," he added. "You are out of your blasted mind." "No, I really am remembering more and more," Billy said, closing his eyes in thought. "Poseidon's Peak is a mountain that rises from the ocean floor. This is the very top. We're at the, he struggled to remember. "Peak?" Jack suggested dryly. "Yes, peak," Billy said gratefully. "Of Poseidon's Peak. The rest of the mountain is under us." "Yes, well, here's my problem with your little story," Jack said, leaning forward. "You might remember telling me, not that much earlier in our relationship, that you were there, on Poseidon's Peak, that there was treasure in a cavern inside of it. Now tell me, how can that be if it's under the sea? Unless there's something else you've forgotten, like you're half merman and can breathe underwater." "It's inside," Billy said, struggling to remember. "Inside. There is a cave, a cavern. You can breathe, I think. I think that's how it happened to me," he said, looking at his scraped and scratched arms. "I was in there." "A cavern, in a cave, in a mountain under the sea," Jack said, trying to look on the bright side. "If you're right, then at least we don't have to worry about those other pirates finding the treasure first. Now, I don't suppose you remember how to get into this magical cavern of treasure, do you?" "No," Billy said unhappily. "Of course not," Jack said. "Okay, let's try not to be negative, tankard half full and all that," Jack continued. He tried to mask his impatience behind a teacher-like voice. He pressed his lips together. "Try again. You just remembered where we were. That's very good." Billy beamed. "Now," Jack continued, forcing a smile, "let's try to remember what the rest of it, savvy?" Billy frowned. He thought very hard. He scratched his temple. Then he shrugged. All right then," Jack said soothingly. "Maybe you hit your head on a rock or something and made you forget. Perhaps we can, reverse the process, clear all the cobwebs." Bloody Billy looked terrified. Jack felt around behind him with his hand until he found a loose stone on the boulder-sized island that the three of them were crowded upon and broke it off. The way a doctor would, by reapplying force to the affected area. "That only works in stories," Billy finally protested, guessing what Jack meant to do. He covered his head in fear. Jack rolled his eyes and tossed the rock into the sea. "You are not very cooperative," he said in disgust. "I'm trying, Jack. I really am," Billy said with meaning. "I remember the treasure." "Treasure?" Jack's eyes lit up. "It's not gold or jewels or anything like that." Jack's face fell. "It's more powerful than all that." Jack's eyes lit up again. "Do go on," he said. "It's the sea god, Poseidon," Billy said, trying to explain it simply and not in his usual way of speaking, in case Jack decided to bop him on the head anyway. "It's his trident. It's in a chamber somewhere below us. The trident is very powerful. It's the weapon of a god. It can cause earthquakes, wreck ships, summon the kraken, and then there is the most important part," he said in a whisper. "More important than wrecking ships and calling down the wrath of the heavens?" Jack asked mockingly. "It can control the merfolk," Billy said, remembering with an awed hush. "All of them. If you have the trident, you can control every merman, mermaid, and merchild in the seven seas." Jack was silent. That was really important. Huge, in fact. Whoever had the trident would rule the oceans. He could decide which ships got to sail where. He could force whole countries to pay him ransom to let ships through. He would be free to do whatever he wished, wherever he wished. Constance, slipping a little on the rock, chose that moment to reposition herself and dig in her claws into Jack's foot, that is. Ow! Jack spluttered, his glorious daydream interrupted. Constance made a purring sound and looked at him, as if to say, "Oops, sorry I accidentally clawed you." "You stupid, useless, mangy thing!" Jack cried, forgetting how the cat had just saved them all from the natives. "You like swimming so much? Here's another chance to practice." And with that, he picked her up and threw her into the sea. The cat hissed and desperately flung her paws out, trying to keep her head above the waves, and then she slipped under. A trail of bubbles went down behind her into the deep. "Oh," Jack said, horrified. He only meant to scare her, not drown her. She might have been a mangy, awful cat thing, but she had also been a member of his crew, and she was possibly John's sister. "Oh, heavens," Billy said in his vague way. "Blast, blast, blast," Jack said under his breath. He kicked the rock when he was standing upon, which he still didn't believe was really Poseidon's peak. Then the water exploded, and a yowling, screaming thing came tearing out of it. Jack and Billy screamed and grabbed onto each other. "Kraken!" Jack cried. But it was Constance, leaping back onto the rock behind him. Jack clutched his chest, where his heart raced wildly. "Don't do that!" Constance ignored him. Instead, she ran straight back to the water and dove in. A moment later, her wet little head popped up again. She meowed and pawed at the water. "You want us to come and take a swim with you?" Jack asked slowly. Without hesitation, Billy executed a sweeping dive into the ocean. Jack looked around. Nothing for miles. He was either going to stand here and survive for a day or two, or he could follow the cat and the crazy man and hope for the best. Sighing, Jack held his nose and jumped in. Alright, so before we continue, we have something to quickly talk about, and that is the Trident of Poseidon. Yes, the Trident of Poseidon is what Jack is now after here. And you may be asking yourself, wait, didn't we find the Trident of Poseidon in Pirates of the Caribbean 5? Yes, we did. But of course, the people who wrote that movie did not read this book, or probably even know of its existence, and did not know the Trident had already been established in the Pirates world. So this makes for an interesting plot hole, as we will come to know, of two separate Tridents of Poseidon that happen to also have differing powers. And as Billy states in this book, the Trident can cause earthquakes, wreck ships, and even summon the Kraken. But its main power here is that it has the ability to control the merfolk. Now, the Trident from the movies, at least to our knowledge, does not do any of this, but the movie version of the Trident was not fleshed out at all in its power set. The only thing we really know about the movie version of the Trident is that it holds all the power of the sea, along with every curse. Breaking the movie Trident breaks every curse on the ocean, of course setting Will Turner free at the end of Pirates 5. But that is all we really know about the movie version. So yes, this will get a bit confusing as this book and the next one deal with the Trident of Poseidon. And this is probably the biggest point of confusion in this whole series now. Of course, this was not a problem back in 2007 when this book was written, but it is a problem we have now. So going forward, we will see that in the book, they refer to it as Poseidon's Trident, and the movie version is referred to as the Trident of Poseidon. So from now on, I will keep that distinction in the naming convention, because at least that is different. But just know that this Trident in the book series is technically different from the one from the movies, but if you want to imagine them both as the same thing, you can do that as well. Okay, now that we've gotten that established, let's move on. So Jack and Billy follow Constance into the water, and as they follow her down, they eventually find their way into an underwater cavern, very similar to the one under Isla Serena that Jack visited in Book 2 and 4, and they are faced with over a dozen passages in front of them. So we're going to go back into the book and see what happens next. As the group's eyes grew used to the gloom, the far edges of the chamber came into focus. A dozen or more passages, black and cold, led off in every direction. "All right, Mr. Half-Remembering Billy," Jack began. "I thought my name was Bloody Billy. That's what you called me before," Billy said. Jack rolled his eyes. "Just pay attention, will you? What's behind door number 1, or 2, or 3, or 13? Billy blinked. "I don't see any doors, Jack. Just caves. Does any of this look familiar to you?" Billy thought hard. It was obvious from the way he squinted his gray eyes. "I don't know, Jack," he finally said sadly. Constance sneezed again. Then she took off into one of the caves, quickly disappearing into the darkness. "Well, that's it for her then," Jack said. Not upset at all. He turned back to Billy. Now, where were we? Maybe we should follow her, Billy suggested hesitantly. After all, she found this place. Jack grumbled and frowned at the idea of having to follow Constance, but perhaps Billy had a good point. Well, the blasted cat thing can see in the dark better than we can, after all, he conceded. But just so you know, in the future, it's the captain who comes up with the good ideas, and not just any captain. This one, right here, Captain Jack Sparrow. And with a dignified twirl, he marched after Constance. Only 20 steps in, and the darkness was complete. The tunnel's ceiling was just a few inches above Jack's head. Bloody Billy had to stoop. Jack let one hand brush along a wall to keep his orientation, and he stopped immediately when something slimy moved underneath his fingertips. While the floor was mostly worn smooth, there were treacherous stalagmites here and there, and puddles of ooze and slime. The constant sound of dripping moisture echoed through the cavern. Now and then, something slithered wetly in front of or over his feet, and sometimes things, little things with big teeth, would snap at his boots. Occasionally, their teeth bit right through the leather. Jack gritted his teeth and pushed on. Once in a while, Constance would meow to let them know she was still there, ahead of them. After what seemed like an eternity of walking in darkness, they emerged into the light. Right back into the chamber they had started from. Brilliant! We've just walked into a complete circle, Jack said. I guess this is what I get for listening to a cat and a bloody lunatic. Billy looked quietly perplexed. Constance was moving from archway to archway, sniffling carefully at each of the chamber entrances. Then she darted back through one they had just emerged from, meowing loudly. Billy started to follow her. Negative, Jack said, putting his hand out to stop him. No, nay, nine, none, and generally not at all. We are not following that flea-bitten, mangy furball in a circle again. We're going to strike out on our own, like the intelligent human beings that we are. Jack, that's not fair to Constance, Billy protested. We have no idea how many twists and turns there were back there. It was completely dark. Maybe she took the wrong one and is now trying to find the right path. We should try again. No, Jack said, marching across the chamber. In a fit of sheer pique, he chose the cave exactly opposite the one they had just come through. But as soon as he put one foot in, an unearthly howl reverberated through the chamber. It sounded like a cross between a rabid wolf and bleating cow. Jack quickly ran back out. All right, he said, fixing his bandana. We'll follow the cat. Jack ran his hand along the wall. Again. And sometimes he felt teeth biting through his leather boots. Again. Jack gritted his teeth and pushed on. Again. Once in a while, Constance would meow to let them know she was still there, ahead of them. Again. When they finally came out, it was into the same chamber. Again, Jack said. Well, that does it. He skipped over to Constance. Constance growled and hissed at Jack. Then she turned and went into the same passageway. Again. Jack was so flabbergasted he could barely speak, an extremely unusual state for him. He turned to Billy. But he stopped when noises came from another tunnel. Heavy boots clomping, chains rattling, general piratey noises. It must be the pirate crew, Billy called out. He turned to follow Constance. We must advance, or they will find the treasure before we do. And who knows what such vicious and terrible pirates could do with such power as is contained in Poseidon's trident. Sorry, mate, there is no way I'm going through there just to come out here again, Jack protested. The footsteps came closer. They could hear other noises now, sabers rattling, grumbling voices in guttural tones. What shall we do then? Billy asked, his eyes a bit glazed over. But before Jack could answer, a bronze gate came crashing down over a cave entrance, and then another one, and another one. Gates were coming down all over the passageways from one end of the room to the other, cutting off their escape routes. Billy ran after Constance. More gates crashed down. The footsteps came closer. Soon there were only two passageways left open, the one Constance and Billy had gone through and the one that led to the pirates. So let's see here, Jack said philosophically. Run headfirst into a gang of violently angry and armed pirates, or follow that wet, stinking cat in circles again. He scratched his chin, thinking. The final two gates began to close. Oh, all right, he sighed and dashed after Constance and Billy. But the footsteps kept coming. The pirates had followed them into the tunnel. You! A deep, powerful, and very strong male voice called out. You who? Jack called back. No one here, mate, sorry. Not sure who you're talking to. Must be going mad. Just echoes in here, that's all. You! See? He began to run, which is why it hurt an awful lot when he slammed into Billy, who stood stock still at the tunnel's exit. Room for your captain, then, Jack said, preparing to push him aside and keep running. but then Jack stopped too. They were now in a chamber filled, and absolutely filled, with artifacts and gewgaws and antiques and treasures and things. Egyptian death masks, tea sets, Greek statues, pearl necklaces, silver fountains, used spittoons, golden chairs, jewel-encrusted lanterns, chests piled high with ancient money, glass mirrors, swords, wooden teeth, piles of emeralds. In the middle of the room was a low pool, whose sides were covered with gems and pearls. It was filled with black, viscous water, and in the center was a pure white coral pedestal that looked like it should have been the stand for something really fantastic. But there was nothing there. Jack's jaw dropped in awe. Even Constance appeared dumbfounded. She stood still, eyes darting from treasure to treasure. She fixed on a jeweled brooch, fashioned after a rat. They were so astounded that they forgot about their pursuers, who crashed out of the tunnel and onto them, toppling everyone and a few treasures to the ground. "Jack?" a familiar voice said. "Belle?" Jack asked, replying out of force of habit to a voice that sounded like his former first mate's. But then, "Constance!" a green-eyed boy said with delight. "John?" Jack asked, unable to believe what he was seeing. "And Billy! Billy Turner! It really is ye! You've made it out alive! You found Jack!" Arabella shouted. "Mr. Reese! John! Have you apprehended the culprits?" An authoritative female voice demanded. "How they'll rule the day when they cross the crew of the Fleur de la Mort! How I'll enjoy making them answer to me, Captain Laura Smith!" Laura, as dramatic as ever," Jack said coolly, picking himself up and dusting himself off. His entire old crew was there, except for Fitzwilliam P. Dalton III. And Arabella's mother, Captain Laura Smith, and her dashing first mate, Mr. Reese, were there too. "Laura, still as ornery as ever. The months we've spent apart hasn't changed you any, I see," Jack said. "You!" Captain Smith shouted, tossing her hair in surprise and anger at seeing Jack. "Yes," Jack said with a grin, "me. Now, do you mind telling me how you all came to be here, and what in the name of Davy Jones' locker is going on?" Alright, so now we know why Constance was on the island, and it's because the old crew was nearby. Finally, we see the return of all of our old friends from earlier in the series. Arabella is back, along with her mother Laura and Mr. Reese, and John and Tumen are back as well. Of course, the only person we're missing here is Fitzwilliam, but as I said earlier, we won't be seeing him again in this series. And we also got a big reveal as to who Billy is, and most of you already probably guessed it since his name is Billy. But yes, Billy's last name is Turner, which means he is Bootstrap Bill Turner, father of Will Turner. Very exciting to see him introduced here because from the movies, we understand that Jack and Bootstrap were good friends. And Bootstrap was the only person who stood up for Jack during the mutiny on the Black Pearl. And don't worry, if you want to know more about Bootstrap Bill's early life, once we cover the final book in the series next time, there's one more book that is focused entirely on Bootstrap, and we'll cover that once we get there. But anyway, back to Poseidon's Peak. So Arabella runs over to Billy and Jack, and to Jack's surprise, she runs right past him and into Billy's arms. And guess what? They kiss! So we find out Arabella and Billy are in love, which to you pirate sleuths out there, you may be forming some theories about these two being together. And yes, we will talk about that theory in the episode covering the tale of Billy Turner. But we're going to finish out the book here with this last reading, so here we go. "Congratulations on your apparent soulmate discovery, but it's not something we all need to witness, savvy?" Jack said. "Sorry, Jack," Arabella said with a beautiful grin, her eyes still fixed on Billy. "Can I introduce you to bosun and third mate of the floor, Billy Turner?" "Dumb name," Jack said without any hesitation. "I'd stick with Bloody Billy, if I were you. Besides, Belle, he doesn't really seem to be your type, all mushy and, frankly, odd." "Oh, you're one to talk about odd, Jack," Arabella said. "I'm remembering it all now," Billy interrupted, sitting down on a chest of trinkets. "These are the pirates who were after the treasure." "What, this lot?" Jack asked, jerking his thumb toward Laura. Captain Smith bridled with indignation. "I thought you meant real pirates." "You think just because I'm a woman I cannot be a pirate captain?" Arabella's mom said indignantly. No, Jack said soothingly. "Absolutely, women can be real pirates. I just meant you can't be because you're bad-tempered, huffy, very rude, incompetent, and a general blowhard." Speechless with rage, Captain Smith lunged at him. Mr. Reese held her back. Jack ignored both of them. "You were saying, Billy? Go on, he prodded. "The Navy. "Picked me up for being a pirate," Billy said, putting a hand to his head. "But I wasn't. I just didn't have the right papers. It was all a horrible, horrible mistake. And then they came across the Fleur de la Mort, and we were attacked. It was a close battle." "Nonsense," Captain Smith sniffed. "But the good lady here drove them off and rescued me, thinking that I was a pirate." Billy looked up at Jack and shrugged. "So I joined them. I tried the honest route, and look where it got me. The pirates were far more gentlemanly." Laura Smith glared at him. Womanly," Billy quickly corrected. Mr. Reese glared at him. Man and womanly," Billy said desperately. "So you were one of the pirates that we were racing against to get the treasure," Jack said smugly. "Unfortunately, yes," Billy said with a wan smile. "That's just lovely," Jack said, sighing. "So, how did you lot wind up here?" "We unfurled our sails," Laura Smith picked up where Billy left off, "the mainsail, which makes the floor invisible, but not before heading further out into the Caribbean, away from the Yucatan, to throw the Navy off our trail. We were just past Antigua," Arabella said with a sigh, remembering, "when we got caught on a reef. Despite being invisible," Billy continued, "we were caught there like lobsters in a trap. We were abducted." "The Navy was able to trace you all that way and catch you, even though you were invisible?" Jack asked, surprised and impressed. "Not man's Navy," came an eerily familiar voice. "Us." With an oily, liquidy splash, the dark water in the pool before them rippled. Emerging from the waves were Morvarin, Aquala, and Aquila. The three made the head council of the merfolk. "Oh, not you, blasted scaly tails," Jack groaned. "We are the appointed keepers of Poseidon's trident," Morvarin said grandly. "It is a weapon of the gods with great powers," Aquila hissed. "Poseidon used it to torment us for generations, controlling us, making us do whatever he wished." Jack had to admit that it must have been pretty funny. Imagine being able to make those merfolk do whatever you wanted. He had visions of a mermaid feeding him sardines with another one juggling cats, and one cat in particular for his entertainment. Morvarin continued. "Hundreds of years ago, the merfolk finally won the trident away from the god of the seas in a great contest of skill." "Oh, that must have been something to watch," Jack said dryly, imagining these tailed creatures attempting to jump through hoops. The merfolk ignored him. "We won our freedom. His staff and his chariot became ours. The trident was hidden here, and the chariot is still hidden, buried on an island not far from where we now speak. Now someone else has finally found the trident and is capable of complete control of the whole race of merfolk," Aquala said, "and is wreaking havoc upon the seven seas." "Everyone except we three of the Bluetails," Morvarin added, with a thwack of her own tail. The incredibly rare race of merfolk was apparently unaffected. "And this is the part where I care?" Jack said, leaping up into a gilded throne and casually leaning back. "You scaly tails have never been a particularly pleasant lot, and you've wreaked havoc on the seas before without the excuse of someone else's trident. The only thing I'm sorry about is I didn't find the trident first." "We've never upset the balance of the seas," Aquala said through gnashed fangs. "Now an entire army of merfolk is amassing, possibly to wage a great war." "Still not the part where I care," Jack pointed out. "Jack!" Arabella admonished him. He shrugged helplessly. It was almost like old times. "This is the point where you should care," Morvarin said sternly. She tossed her glimmering red hair. "We captured the floor looking for you, since we believed you were the only land dweller clever enough to secure the trident." "Really? Me?" Jack said, sitting up. "You think I'm the cleverest person in the world?" Morvarin ignored him. "But your filthy cat escaped. She jumped ship and swam for shore. Horrible beast." "Well, you and I agree there, at least," Jack said, sighing. "She is filthy, but good job upsetting that half-fish," he added to Constance, patting her on the head. Constance meowed quietly and purred. "We brought the rest of the crew for safekeeping here under Poseidon's Peak, where we merfolk keep the spoils of all of our greatest wars," Aquala continued. "Greatest wars, huh?" Jack asked, holding up the set of wooden teeth he spotted earlier. "We used our looking pool, which allowed us to observe the world above," Aquila hissed. "Was buried," Jack corrected without thinking. "What?" Morvarin asked. "Nothing," Jack said quickly. "Please continue with your fascinating story." "We knew you were our only hope when we saw you, Jack," Arabella said. "John managed to pick the locks to the cages we were kept in, but we got lost in the tunnels that riddled the mountain." "Why does everyone want something from me?" Jack mumbled. I was sucked up by a water spout. One of their traps, Billy said, remembering. It jettisoned me up and out, through the sea, and several reefs of very sharp, very hard coral, he added, rubbing his head and looking at the wounds on his body. You're not too hurt, are you, Billy? Arabella asked, laying a concerned hand on Billy's shoulder. That explains the, Jack made crazy motions. Billy shivered. I'd be happy if I never saw another slimy, sharp, nasty sea critter again. But I found you. I found Jack. A lot of good it did us, though, he finished sadly, looking around the room. You must help us, Jack, Morvern demanded. You and the crew of the Floor. Now, just hold your seahorses there, mate, Jack said, finally losing his temper. He leaped off the throne and walked toward the merfolk, grabbing a deadly-looking silver sword from a pile of loot as he went. The crew of the Floor and his friends drew back. They had never seen the even-tempered Jack Sparrow so angry before. But it was happening more often since Fitzy turned mutinous and Teague had appeared back in Jack's life. First, you try to kidnap me to steal something back for you, he growled. Then, you actually kidnap my old crew, hoping they lead you to me. Then, after we've all been battered and tossed about by your stupid little fish games, you demand our help? After everything you've done? You scaled scallywags, Captain Smith barked, drawing her own sword and advancing with Jack. You tailed tarts. Of all the nerve, we should skin you now and have you in a chowder for all you've done. For once, Captain Smith, you and I are in agreement, Jack said, though I don't really want to think about what mermaid chowder might taste like. It's delicious, Laura said with a twisted smile. Mother, Arabella snapped. Or so I've heard, Laura said quickly. Let's just get you out of here, Billy suggested. He was obviously done with all of his adventures at sea. John, Tuman, and Arabella all nodded in agreement. Jack looked disgusted. All right, you've lucked out. We'll just go on our way, and just then, the cavern began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling, along with bits of debris. Jack was about to accuse the merfolk of more tricks, but they looked just as surprised and terrified as everyone else. There were several loud cracks that sounded like thunder. Everything shook. Large pieces of rock and coral tumbled down from the walls. Shells were crushed into a fine white powder. Then, the rattling stopped and dust settled into the watery chamber, which suddenly didn't seem all that stable. As the dust settled, a figure appeared in silhouette at the center of the pool where this pedestal stood. A sudden spark filled the room, followed by a series of popping, sizzling electrical noises. Before the crew was a tall, grimy man. He wore a long, torn overcoat, and his dark black hair hung in front of his eyes, which sparked like lightning. He rode the chariot Jack and Billy had found. In one hand, he snapped silver reins. In the other, he held the giant trident, and he didn't look happy. Oh my, it's Torrance! The terrible, awful captain we battled in our first adventure together, Arabella whispered in awe. And he's got an entire mermaid army fighting for him, Billy Turner said. Jack looked anxious, but determined. Like it or not, Grand Mistress Scalytail, Jack said grimly to Morvern, I suppose we're involved in your little war now. To be concluded. And that is the end of Book 11, Poseidon's Peak. Yeah, you didn't think we were finished with Torrance yet, did you? It's pretty fitting and really cool that Torrance is the final villain we'll be facing in the last book, as he, of course, was the first villain introduced in the first book, The Coming Storm, as Arabella just said. And now he has Poseidon's trident, along with the chariot, so we'll get to see what happens in the next episode. And yes, the next book is indeed the final book of the Young Jack Sparrow series. It is called Bold New Horizons, and it is really, really exciting. You are not going to want to miss that, so make sure to come back here next time to see how the Young Jack Sparrow series ends. And after we cover Bold New Horizons, there is technically one more book in the series, but it is a super special called The Tale of Billy Turner and Other Stories. We'll be covering that afterward to finish out the series before we move on to The Price of Freedom. But thank you for joining me on this episode, and I hope you have been enjoying these episodes covering the Young Jack Sparrow series. I have really enjoyed it, and especially really enjoyed being able to share these books with people who either didn't know they existed or maybe hadn't had a chance to read them themselves. But if you have read these books before and you've been listening to these episodes, thank you so much. I know the Young Jack Sparrow fandom is out there somewhere, very small fandom, but I know you guys love these books, so I hope I'm doing them justice. And thanks to everyone who has listened to the podcast and allowed me to continue jabbering about Pirates of the Caribbean ad nauseum. I really love sharing my love of this world with you, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you if you've rated or reviewed the podcast wherever you listen, and thank you if you bought merch, which you can find on TeePublic in the episode description. And I will see you all next time for the exciting conclusion of the Young Jack Sparrow series, Bold New Horizons. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean and over on Twitter/X at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia over there, so make sure to go check those platforms out. And you can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon and always remember, dead men tell no tales.